Okay, Act 3.
The final act.
The final act. So we've talked a little bit about how we really define risk in an environment like ours. We've talked about how to measure it, or maybe the lack thereof an ability to accurately measure it, and that maybe chasing that measurement point isn't necessarily the right way to look at it. And I've always really felt that to get away from that safety bucket, old school industrial attitude, was to move toward more of a viewpoint of accepting the fact that we work in a dangerous environment, and how can we be more resilient and deal with those things. So that's why Act 3 is creating resilience. So
yeah, and really resilience, what does that mean? It means bad things will happen.
Right.
We have to be able to absorb that, recover,
Right.
regain our original shape, so to speak, and move on and continue mission.
Right.
And so that all comes with the first place where that starts is this concept of margin.
Right.
You know, maybe you could talk a little bit about what margin means to you.
So I think margin is resiliency, and I think it creates time and space for option. The more options you have, the better off you are, right?
Yeah.
The more margin you have, the better you're able to withstand some bad thing coming along and knocking us off course. But the longer we wait, that margin is going to be reduced, because the longer we wait, tick, 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 the options start to slip away.
So this is the time wedge, and the reason it's called that is the tick, tick, tick you just mentioned. This is our ability to create a course of action, make a decision.
Maneuvering room, whatever.
And so, obviously, if we come into this from our decision making, it's part of the decision making cycle. And if we have a lot of slides and we're doing things well, a lot of experience, we can drop out of this fairly quickly and go on to the actual making of the decision. But if time is moving on and we're still trying to make a decision, and we get pushed down into this pointy edge of the time wedge,
you have less options even available.
The environment is driving you, and all you can do is react to it.
So the goal might be to try to not to make decisions rapidly without knowing what's going on, but developing a system that once you arrive at a course of action, you can deploy it quickly.
And keep building in margin for yourself. Keep doing things, making decisions, and taking actions that help you buy more time. And
I think the second part of that is important, because we don't want people to get caught up in thinking they need to decide something really quickly and just jump on it. But what it is we need to be able to, once we make that decision, they need to have the freedom to take action and to do it, and not be constrained by something else going on.
Preserve options. And so to your point, what if we do have to make a really fast decision? Well, maybe we don't have to make the whole decision. Maybe we can make the decision to, okay, we know we have to get that search done. Let's get the search underway. But that actually gives us some time, because that's happening.
Took action.
Now we can come up with a better plan, because that has to happen.
Right.
These other things, we've got choice A, B, C. This has to happen. So let's get that moving. That alone bought us more time and is preserving our options. That's right. And there's a lot of other ways to think about margin and creating margin and moving ourselves back to give us that time and space for decisions. So one example of that, we have individual things, there's systemic things you can do as a leader, there's actions you can do, there's organizational things, and I think we'll end up talking about all of that.
Right.
But the most individual, basic example that I could think of for a firefighter that is within her or his control is air management. So we hear about air management. I went on an exercise. We do a lot of training in Australia. They have the Country Fire Authority in Victoria, 50,000 firefighters, and many of their fire brigades would be volunteers, but they also are urban firefighters. They are the fire department in huge, big, built-up urban areas.
Sure.
So I went with this one brigade, and they invited me along on a training exercise in the back end of a big mall. And so they were doing response and searching and doing that to a big mall fire, and they had filled up the back end of the mall with training smoke and things like that. And I went in, partnered up with the captain to do the primary search, the brigade captain. And we went in there, and of course, safety officer, we read our air gauges and did all that kind of good stuff, and off we went. And it was relatively physical because they had the dummies in there, and we had to move all those big wire
obstacles.
Yeah, shelves that they would have in a mall, and move this stuff. And I knew going into it, this was my first time on an SCBA. But I've been a scuba diver and done, obviously, in the military, all the breathing with masks and various respirators, and understand air management.
Right.
And I had heard that this was like a big deal for them. I didn't really...
Who can conserve the most? Right.
Yeah. I didn't understand. I mean, I knew a little bit about it.
Right.
But anyway, so we go in, and I'm like, well, I'll be damned if I'm coming out of here with the least amount of air. Right. And, meanwhile, I've got this great captain with me, and I'm like, I'll die before. This is just our stupidity. We talked about the bias before, and all that. We're prisoners of our own culture, right? We'll kill ourselves to
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm doing all of that, and we get the dummy, and we wrestle them out and report back to the safety officer when we come out, and grabs our air gauges. That's it. Well, I can see out of the corner of my eye, the captain is like looking,
chicken hawking over his shoulder.
Yeah, what is that? And I could just sort of feel this like little double take, because I could tell the captain was surprised. And in a second, I just get this, not bad, mate. And I knew it's like, yeah. But the point of that, and that was just bringing in skills from a completely different environment as a first timer,
right?
And yet being able to, so what is that margin? And there's all this body of research and studies and blah 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 blah, that using those breathing techniques can actually add 20 to 40% on a bottle. Now, how much margin?
That's options.
Yeah, how much margin is that as far as time and options? If you get your foot stuck in a floor, right?
Right, yeah.
And when we say this breathing, in the military, we call it combat breathing. And there's these techniques that is like the box method, breathe in for 3 or 4 seconds, hold 3 or 4, out 3 or 4, rest 3 or 4. Or there's triangle breathing, same kind of cycle. And of course, it all comes from yoga. So it's like 3,500 years old.
Right.
But in Special Forces, we can't do yoga. So we have to call it combat breathing.
Because everybody buys into combat
breathing. Right. But there are firefighters. There's a firefighter I know up in Peterborough, Canada, in Ontario, and Dave Gillespie. He is training people in these techniques, not as a member of Peterborough, but his own thing, trying to share these simple breathing techniques and extending 40 to 40% on a bottle. So you look at that, and it's like, that's a lot of margin that every single person has within their control to create options. Because what if you just get your foot stuck in the floor?
Right. Well, and you have to control. I've heard a couple other people talk about the importance of being able to don your gear really rapidly. Because if you look at responding to a fire, the moment you get out at the fire and step onto the street, there's a ton of unpredictability, and there's a lot of things that are now out of your control. The building, the people running around, where somebody's trapped inside, the condition of the fire, you have no control over that. But if you can control how rapidly you can gear up, leave the station, and have good routing to get there, you're buying yourself margin during the time that you're fully in control of your situation. Yeah. That's all you.
Yeah.
And then it gives you more time for options once you're there. So.
Yeah, exactly. And now, so that's at an individual level, a crew level. Now let's go to the very top, culture level, and kind of go back to that mission-driven culture, the principles versus rules a little bit. So example was that we were talking about earlier, the potential of conflicting policies. So I was in Georgia at a big department, huge call volume, and we were talking about this, and one of the chiefs says, I've got an example. And, we're doing this class, and he poses this to the room. He's like, what's our policy, on engaging fire and SCBA? And, of course, the policy is obviously you always have to have SCBA.
Right.
That's it. Now, what's our policy when we're working near the water? We have to have a personal flotation device.
Right.
PFD, right? And it's like, what do we do with a boat fire?
Right.
He's like, well, how do we go down to the marina and there's a boat fire? What are you going to do? And I mean, the debate in the classroom about how they were going to manage that, because they were making this shift, from rules-based, principles-based, and attempting to do this. So later, I'm back. I'm in Colorado. I'm with another big fire department, and I'm using this story as an example, a story of the classroom as an example. It's hypothetical, and the body language in the room is like, it drew some kind of a reaction. There was all these murmurings and discussions and stuff. Well, after we were done, one of the captains came up to me and he says, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that, because we actually had that happen. We went down to the marina at a big reservoir. There's a boat on fire, and we have these, and in our department, those are rules, policies.
Both of them are.
Both of them are rules, right? And you can't wear a SCBA with. So he's like, 3 captains are sitting around arguing. Meanwhile, all of our crews are watching this, figuring out what we're going to do.
Tick, 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 tick.
Tick, tick, tick. Well, while the clock is ticking, the boat breaks burns through its lines and begins drifting over to the other side of the lake, where it impacts and starts. Now, remember, this is like summertime, 4th of July kind of time frame, picnics. So the grass is really high, it's really dry. Whoosh! This thing starts a brush fire that just, now we got a wildfire on our hands. Before it was responding to a boat. Now we got a wildfire, and these guys are like, oh, And guess what? Because we're growing so fast out there, what is now on the other side of all that brush? A brand new spanking subdivision. Yeah, and it just, that's that one little variable, but that is an example of how that rules-based versus principles-based affects risk.
And it increased the complexity.
Increase the complexity, increase the risk.
Right.
Huge. So what does that mean to leaders trying to make decisions, trying to manage this time wedge?
Right. Yeah, the farther you wait to try to reconcile things, it's costing you space on the time wedge, and it's costing you time. And I think a lot of people have been around. When you get to an atypical situation like that, you'll see company officers or supervisors, they're looking at it, and somebody else suggests a solution that will work, but it's non-standard. You almost see this body language with them, like, I know that's the right thing to do, but there's that calculus of, like, it's kind of like when your friend tells you to grab the electric fence, and you kind of steel yourself to go do it, and it's like,
this is gonna hurt.
Right? Yeah. So you're trying to weigh, like, I know that's probably the best option to take care of the incident, but how bad is this going to hurt? Like, do I still dare do it? Or
personal risk, career risk.
And so now, again, tick, 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 like, time's going by, and so, like, we're losing options because we don't feel we have the ability to just adapt and overcome.
Yeah, and this is what goes back to mission-driven culture, which is that disciplined initiative, that individual initiative, but it's disciplined initiative, which is the opposite of freelancing. Right. And another example, totally different department that we work with, where they have made a very concerted department-wide effort to move towards this mission-driven culture type model. So a captain, that engine goes out, responds to a structure fire, and they're given one size up, by dispatch, whatever they think is ground truth at the time. They get out there, whoa, much bigger.
Totally different situation.
Already exposing, adjacent structures, already much bigger than they had thought.
So they're already farther forward in the time wedge than they really even thought they were.
Way forward, right? And so this captain immediately, they have a standard SOP about their initial attack line, whatever, 1 3/4, whatever it is. He's like, I want much bigger.
Pull a 2.5 or something.
Pull a 2.5, pull much bigger. I want that thing drowned. And to the engineer, I want you to get that first water supply established before you don your PPE. And he had calculated this risk versus gain, where that engine was, where the engineer was going to be standing relative, pretty much, out of harm's way type of thing. And okay, that's what they did, and were successful. Now, what did happen was, once the situation was normalized, or what we say, like, ops normal. So
it wasn't now you've moved back to where it's a normal fire.
It's a normal emergency.
Right.
That engineer didn't ever don PPE. So we said you have to be accountable for your decisions.
Right.
So the captain could explain, this is why I did what I did. I calculated the risk versus the gain. The value at risk was now adjacent structures, all the stuff that we talked about before.
Right.
In that judgment, here's what I did. I know what the playbook is.
Right. And this is why I deviated from it, 'cause
Here's
this is what I saw.
the adaptation. This is what I did. This is what I saw. And everybody was like, okay, that makes sense. That's mission-driven
that
culture.
goes back to high trust state too, because you have to trust that person that they were able to correctly perceive their situation. You have to let them have that decision space.
Right. But what about the engineer?
Right. There was a point probably where they could have returned back to the normal way of doing it.
The ops
Right.
normal, and there was was there the time, was there the space, was there
Right.
the opportunity? Yeah, there was. And so now what do we got? Now we've got this accountability issue.
Because now it wasn't deviating from normal to compensate for a situation. Now it sort of is freelancing. And that's, I think, sometimes people look at mission-driven culture or they look at how to create resilience and they see it as, well, you just don't want anybody to get in trouble. That's kind of what the airlines thought of crew resource management right away. It was like they joked around there was charm school. Nobody can get in trouble anymore. But like you said before, there's more accountability because now the point at which there was an opportunity to return to normal and you didn't, now you're accountable for that decision too.
Now you're accountable. And so and the engineer was like, yeah, that's on me. I chose that. And so they all talked about it. Captain and engineer got together. Engineer proposed that he make a video that could be shared with the department, explaining what it was, explaining that was not in mission-driven culture and why, and try to communicate that lesson to everybody else. Brought that to management. Management bought off. Union bought off, and it was appropriate. It was proportional. It was, and it was shared. And now there's a lesson: the continuous improvement. Because if it had gone the other way, pilot error, you
Right.
let go of that hose line, you get a letter of
How could you not wear
disciplinary.
your SOP?
Yeah.
We have a rule for that.
And all of a sudden, now what happens? Now management labor,
Yep.
blah blah blah. There's all this confidentiality. Nobody can share what's going on. Nobody learns anything. It's all rumor and
Right.
innuendo. It's
Yeah.
them and us, and and that's what you have.
Yeah. No, and I think it's you're better off when you can allow for that decision space. You can figure out a way to create it by controlling what you can, and then the last part of it is you have to be willing to learn when something doesn't go normally, or when it goes well, to not just to realize maybe when you were accidentally successful,
Right.
which is when the call gets done and everybody drives back and no one talks in the cab on the way back, and everybody's like, wow, that was crazy. Nobody wants to say anything. It's always a sign that although we were successful, we were probably accidentally successful. We were down, the margin bank was almost NSF at that point. But if it doesn't go well, we have to be willing to share that, learn from it, and not turn it into a punitive thing. Because we know as soon as it becomes a punitive thing, not only is there all the problems you talked about, but likely there's underlying causes of it that we'll never get to it, so it's going to repeat itself. And it's like playing the game whack-a-mole.
Yeah, and that's the tail wagging the dog.
Right.
So now form and function are not being driven by our end state, which is to get better and better.
Right.
It's the opposite.
And as we add more rules to teach people to try to follow the rules that that nobody intentionally violated, because that's always a separate issue, right? With mission-driven culture, we're not talking about somebody who intentionally violated a policy.
Right.
That's a different pathway.
Well,
always will be.
You've got willful violations.
Right.
And you've got basically negligence that reaches a gross negligence level. I mean, you have to deal with those in a more disciplinary type of
we're talking about in the fog of war trying to make a decision that maybe isn't the normal way to do something. That's what we're looking at mission-driven culture for. It doesn't allow people to do whatever they want.
Right.
But in those situations, it's better to try to look at what happened instead of who did it.
Yeah. So another way that we want to, again, what's within our control, how do we move from subjectivity, which we know takes advantage, preys on all of our biases and stress reactions and decisional traps, and how do we buy margin with language?
Yeah.
And where we want to get into there is learning how to be more specific when we talk about risk, because that specificity goes to like calibration, which helps with the quantification, which then helps manage risk real time more effectively. And an example of this would be something like a typical radio report that might say, hey, third floor is filling up with smoke. Okay, that's a true statement.
Right.
Compared to, hey, the third floor smoke is at the doorknob level and it's lowering.
Right. Those are two different pictures of what you should have in your mind.
What does that mean when you're communicating to somebody that isn't there and can't see that?
Right. Yeah, and it helps them understand where you are. So that's that feedback back to command, which allows them to give you task, purpose, and end state that's more in sync with what your situation currently is.
Exactly. And so both are true, but one is more specific and specific about the risk, because that's going to give, obviously I'm not a chief or anything, but I would know that if it's at a doorknob level and going down, from stop, drop, and roll when I was a little kid.
Right, that's bad. Yeah.
I know that, okay, the clock is ticking.
Correct.
Options are running low.
Right.
That, it helps me with that. And so that's that calibration and specificity. So that's the difference between like there's a down power line on the Charlie side of the house
versus coming up and grabbing somebody's SCBA strap and saying, I want you guys to know there's a down power line about 6 feet away from that side of the house. It's really hard to see in the weeds right off the Charlie side. That gives somebody the ability to really know where that is and really operationalize that, other than some vague hazard that is somewhere on that side of the house.
Particularly if you were sitting in staging or you're on a different side, you're likely to remember that, hey, it's really hard to see.
Right.
And so when you end up 20 minutes later
and I'm about 6 feet away from the house and I see some tall grass,
somebody's going to be like, hey, that power line.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm at that Bravo escape window, and the ladder looks really steep to me.
Right. The better way to get on the radio might be, I'm at the Bravo escape window. I need the ladder repositioned so it's less steep because I need to be able to facilitate a head first bailout. We've got to bail out of this window because it's starting to flash.
Yeah.
So now whoever comes to do it, they know why I need that ladder moved.
And they have a sense of time as far as how much time wedge they have left.
Which is not much at that point.
Not much at that point, right? Versus we're still in an early stage and this is a precautionary thing.
Right.
There would be a lot more time wedge.
Correct.
If you said a different thing. So I think, just those quantifying your language as much as you can in a situation is automatically buying you time and options and giving other people time and options.
Correct.
And so it's reducing that subjectivity, which makes it a better management process. Probably the other big thing that's within our control is trigger points.
Yeah.
Establishing and using trigger points to manage time and add margin. So, one thing that's come up lately is, hey, if we get an infectious disease call,
right,
then we're going to use a 1 in and 3 out. So a trigger point is a pre-planned action when you come into a predetermined situation.
Right.
So if we get this infectious disease call, potentially COVID, we'll do this 1 in and 3 out. So, we'll put our paramedic or whatever in full spacesuit PPE, work within that 6-foot hot zone of the patient. Other 3 crew members stay out, makes an assessment, gives us the word, symptomatic, okay, everybody in spacesuits, or not symptomatic, okay,
have the guy come outside.
And so just something like that is a simple trigger point that really manages your time and options.
Well, and I think the thing with trigger points is there are 2 points. One is they can be thought about before you're in a situation that's really stressful.
They're war gamed, visualization.
Yeah, we know that once we're in a really stressful situation, like there's a point just biologically that it's going to be really hard to rationally think things through again. Everybody says that. I don't even remember doing that when I had to bail out the window, or they talk about how they just felt like everything kind of went white and they just don't remember anything. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a point at which your brain is, you're moving way down into the primitive parts. Yeah, the saber-toothed tiger is chasing you at that point.
Yeah.
So if we have a trigger point, we're having a second to make those decisions before we're in that point. The other thing they can do is they can serve kind of as a wake-up call. If we say, hey, we're going to have a trigger point of, if we don't see progress on putting the fire out in the roof space of this building. By the time it gets to here, if we say that to everybody, then if one person is watching it and they get so task focused, somebody else might say, hey, I think we just hit that trigger point. We were going to switch tactics to this point. And you might be like, it's almost kind of like, I blacked out. What happened? It's like, it's a chance for you to be like, you know what? That's true. A lot of departments use the benchmarks from dispatch.
Right.
They'll call and they'll say, fire command 10-minute mark, fire command 15-minute mark, 20-minute mark. It just stops you for a second and you really look at it and say, I kind of had a trigger point in my mind at the beginning of this that if this hadn't happened by then, we were going to switch to this other tactic. There you are at the fork in the road. It's like a sign that says you're here.
Yeah.
And if we don't establish those ahead of time,
you'll just get sucked into it.
And we talked about how we don't do a good job of seeing when the odds went from 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 200. Those signs are almost like a sign that says, okay, you're at 1 in 1,000 now. And then maybe the next one that you predetermined, you're at 1 in 275 now. It's like, well, I'm getting closer,
I had a great FDNY chief tell me a story. I mean, this guy was a hero on 9/11, got everybody out of the other tower. And he was telling me this story about how he had these engine crews, big, obviously, New York, building. And 3 engine crews went in one after the other, each one saying, we're getting it. Captain, we're making progress. We're kicking ass, chief, whatever. And he looked down and he realized he'd been standing on the hose lay the entire time and it hadn't moved. And so that's what happens without that trigger point.
Right.
He realized there has been no progress, even though, because these guys are in the heat of the moment.
Yeah.
We're getting it, and you're not getting anything.
And we're catastrophically optimistic.
Right.
So we're not looking at ourselves like we're not going to call out and be like, we're not doing a very good job, chief.
And so that even leads us to beyond trigger points into systemic things like ICS, knowing ICS, being a good ICS practitioner of the incident command system, because that's a span of control. Creating divisions, creating things to limit your stress reactions and keep things organized and smooth in the chaos. Even staging. Oh, go ahead.
No, because if you organize that incident and everyone knows where they're at, now people are calmer because they have somebody to report to. Radio traffic goes down, which
gives you more.
Which is pushing you back to the left side of that. The other thing is, as that incident all of a sudden takes a left turn to serious, you've got the structure in place already to be able to take your fingers and kind of pull those strings and expand it a little bit. You're not trying to set that up now in the middle of the chaos.
Yeah, and I've seen that where it's like, why are we creating divisions? It's just still small. But that's a person who's visualizing, setting those trigger points and putting the chess pieces in
Expect
motion.
the best, prepare for the worst.
Exactly, right. And even staging those critical resources like an air unit, or FDNY has a thawing unit. So there's certain days where if you don't get that thing moving early, you
can't get it close enough, or
you could have big problems. And the RIT or RIC team is
that's a great example, because what traditionally did we do in fire? We, because of 2 in 2 out and a lot of other reasons, but it also just kind of got to be habit a lot of places where you got to a fire and it was one of the things on the worksheet or on the tablet command, established RIT, boom, checked it. Here's the timestamp.
Tick.
Yep. So you have an engine assigned to RIT, and they got out the gigantic bag of gear and they set it down. And then there's a lot of departments where they need to stay right there. Not a bad theory, because the incident commander needs to know at a moment's notice, where is my RIT team? So you've got that 3 or 4 person engine crew parked on their tarp with their equipment out, stage ready. They're ready to go inside. So, but now we operationalize it, and that's a rules-based. We're going to do it because of compliance. But when you really look at the mission of going to get somebody, after the Brett Tarver incident in Phoenix, the research Phoenix did, and some subsequent research, we know like somewhere in the order of 10 to 12 people it's going to take to go get a brother or sister firefighter out in full gear. So now that 4-person crew, they're obviously not the complete answer. The other problem with that is the moment that fire has a downed firefighter or a firefighter that's trapped, the priorities of the incident just completely got reevaluated.
Right. You have an incident within an incident.
And probably that fire suppression on that building now, that building just became much less important.
Right.
The fire suppression...
Because the values at risk just changed.
100%. And so instead of just having those people stand there, if you look logically down the road of if they get deployed, another way to look at it is let's have them doing a 360, progressively placing a ladder, stretching a backup line, tasks that they're able to drop at a moment's notice. Not something
they're not critical. Nobody's
critical,
counting on that.
But you're softening up the target and you're building some resiliency so that all of a sudden when you do have to go to the second floor to get the person out, there's a ladder there already, and maybe they can get to that ladder and get themselves out. Something bad happens, you've got another hose line to pull in to try to go in and stay oriented and rescue that person.
Yeah, and I think it's just all about visualizing, using all the resources at hand, again, to split those decisions, take care of this, preserve more options, preserve more time, more possibilities.
Right.
That's what resiliency, as individuals, what can we do in terms of risk is reduce that risk by building that resiliency and having those options. So that, we've told, as we wrap up our Act 1, 2, 3 here, we've told some stories. And I know from talking with you before, you got some pretty strong feelings on stories.
So I've worked with the National Near Miss System, and it's a system that allows firefighters from all across the U.S. and Canada and Mexico to submit a story about something that happened. And it's really important because one of the ways we talk about we need to be more...
Well, do you mean like incident report, or you're talking story?
We're talking a story like I was on an incident and I opened the door of the truck on a highway accident. I stepped out of the truck and caught my boot and fell onto the road, and a vehicle narrowly missed me, and I wasn't using 3 points of contact, and I just want everybody else to know that a story like that where somebody else can look at it and it does two things. One, they don't maybe have to experience that to have learned that lesson. But the second part of it is the best way to get aware of the risks that we have. Because we talked about we're not very good at measuring them. And we need to be more aware of that we work in a risky environment versus thinking of it like safety bucket wise, like we're just going to get rid of these. So if we share stories and we listen to stories like that, that vicarious learning can be almost as good as going through the experience yourself. So if you do
you're going to take some slides away.
Yeah.
Now are they as strong as if you experienced it? But
at least they're there.
But will they come back when they're needed? Yeah. And our whole training, all of our leadership curriculum, all of the kind of stuff that we do, our whole background, it's predicated on a quote. Emotion is the chemical glue that bonds experience to memory.
Right.
And so train as you fight, hands-on, immersive, realistic, iterative, train under stress, stress inoculation, all that stuff. But where it comes to you is stories are emotion. Stories are the emotion about what happened. What did you see? What did you smell? What did you hear? What were you thinking? That you can't get that in a clinical parsing of an accident report, right?
Right.
It's all redacted, and Firefighter 1 went to the second floor, and Firefighter 2, and that's the power of those stories in terms of our ability to learn, because I can't experience, if I experienced all the risks that I did and survived, and then added all the risks you experienced,
you never get anywhere.
We'd be dead.
Right. For sure.
So I have to learn from your stories in order to not have to do that the hard way myself.
And when you read them, the key is to not automatically do, because when you read something like that, it makes you feel bad. You get a little cognitive dissonance. The thing to do is to force yourself to look at it as, okay, what if I was there? Because everybody can say, well, I wouldn't have done that. Well, the person that is telling that story
they should have never done that.
Well, they didn't get up that morning.
They should have never let go of that hose line.
Right, yeah. They didn't get up that morning and say, I'm going to throw caution to the wind and just be irresponsible today. Nobody intends to do that. So it's important that we, when we read a story like that, or when we listen to a story like that, we allow that emotional part to take hold, because then we'll remember it. The other thing to remember about near-miss reports is if we look at, we have 80 to 100 firefighters that die every year, and then however many they get seriously injured, we can look at those data points, or we can look at a ton of stories that everybody has, and it could be formally through the firefighter near-miss reporting system, or it could be on the back of a tailboard at your station. By listening to those, we have a lot more opportunities to learn. If we can only learn the 80, 90, or 100 lessons a year, it limits our ability to really understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And that limits our ability to really wrap our head around how risky our job is.
Yeah. Well, we always say anytime we use a story, a case study, a book, an experience, a video clip of people, we always reinforce, we're not studying them.
Right.
We're studying us.
Yeah.
That's why in the military we go do staff rides of battles that are hundreds of years old.
Right.
Because the fundamentals, the tactics, the technology's changed, but that human stuff that we talked about,
It's present.
those decisional traps, the biases, that has not changed. And it's always about learning about us from being in their shoes.
Yeah. No, for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that takes us, another way to think about storytelling is after action reviews, in the
Right.
sense of trying to build the story of what happened collectively. What's your thoughts on?
Well, and they can range from like a large formal one down to like there's a ton of value in an engine crew on the way back.
Yeah.
The captain saying, "What do you guys think?" Something as simple as a medical call. Somebody might bring something up. The value of them is that everyone that's involved sees the incident from everybody else's viewpoint. When I worked in wildland,
Because everybody's got blinders,
Yeah,
right? You're
right.
only seeing what you saw on your assignment, on your side.
and you're part of the incident.
Yeah.
And when I worked in wildland, the value of this got driven home on prescribed fires. Because you'd be burning a prescribed fire, especially we did a lot of like tall grass prairie burns, and things can happen pretty quickly with wind on those. It's a really volatile fuel. And you'd have a burn where all of a sudden, if you're on the holding side, before you could have a chance to close that up, that head fire is rapidly moving towards you.
Yeah.
And the smoke's leaning over, and it becomes no longer like a case of maintaining a perfect ignition pattern to let's just close the door in this thing, because as we look next door, we have unbroken fuels in the next unit that are going to this is going to go really big, and we don't want to have to deal with that today.
And not everybody on that big burn, that could be a big geographic operation, sees that.
Right. And so then you're done, and you're like, those crazy, why would they have done that on the other side of the burn? Why would they send headfire away like that? And you go to the after action review, and everybody starts talking, and all of a sudden you realize that
You're like,
if you would have switched crews,
right,
it would have happened the exact same way because of the cars that we ever
or
dealt with,
somebody's
wind
going to
or
say,
whatever.
like, that's when that happened, because I was seeing this and I thought I heard on the radio.
I didn't know why you were doing that, but
yeah.
No, and that's the value of it is so.
And again, everybody has those slides.
Right.
Everybody now, you saw what you saw, but now you took my slides, I took your slides. We all have this context now around the whole.
And it's like an exponential increase in learning, because you think if you have, just simple math, you have 10 people on the burn. Now each of those 10 people learn the other 10 lessons.
Yeah.
You start running the numbers on that, and like your amount of learning, it just skyrockets because everyone's able to see it from different viewpoints.
Well, and that kind of wraps up with that mission-driven culture value of continuous improvement.
Right.
And we were talking last night, and you talked about that great quote from the blog that why do we keep doing this? So why aren't we learning? And the institutions can't learn.
Why can't the fire service learn not to do this?
Why can't the fire service learn?
Right, because they can't. It's not a person.
Institutions can't learn.
Right.
People learn.
Right.
And people share that learning.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess, we've talked about some takeaways on, trying to define risk, trying to measure risk real time, trying to managing risk through like building that resiliency.
And understanding that it's going to be present.
Always.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your final thoughts on this, Andy?
I think the biggest thing is to realize that we work in a dangerous environment and not to minimize that, and make our focus on how we can develop systems in place to allow us to make decisions better and allow people to act to accomplish a mission. Because then you're going to be able to continually move forward and navigate around obstacles and stay to the far left side of the time wedge versus the other way around.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right.
This has been great.
Thanks for watching. And
great conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll
have to reach
over
over farther.